Hello everyone and welcome to every episode of the Fairly Oddparents Season 7 and 8 reviewed. Season 7 contains already a lot of episodes, and so adding another season on top of that means we basically have to get moving right now. Episode 101, Anti-Poof. An anti-version of Poof is born and tries to kill him. After the way last season ended, they definitely didn't carry the momentum through to Season 7. Unlike Wishology from last season, there's never any suspense here. There's never any moments where I wonder what's going to happen next, or anything that gives me any reason to care about what's going to happen next. Let's start with Foop himself. The way they set up his introduction is possibly one of the worst ways you could introduce a character. To start, Foop is born after the anti-fairies realize there's an imbalance in the ratio of fairies and anti-fairies. And after he's born, he basically just decides to kill Poof for reasons that they don't do a good job of explaining. And he can talk unlike Poof, but exactly like Stewie Griffin. Yeah, he and Foop have basically the exact same characterization. For instance, why did they feel the need to give him a British accent just like Stewie? If they were already going to characterize him basically the same, then it doesn't make much sense that they go the extra mile to draw the comparison. It makes it seem more lazy than it probably is in reality. It wouldn't be such a huge deal if they didn't create such an uninspired story to put the character in anyway. The story basically goes like this. Foop is born, tries to kill Poof, fails, the end. For a 22-minute episode, you've got to have more than that. And because I wasn't a huge fan of the stylistic decisions in this episode, that turns it into a
bad episode.
And jokes can't really save it either. I know the episode tried to have its funny moments, but they're just not as clever as they have the potential to be. Nor as clever as they have been before. 102A, Add-A-Dad. Timmy wishes up many replacement dads to spend time with. So, actually, I've already reviewed this episode way before I even did this series. I'd suggest not watching that old video, as the review I'm about to do more accurately represents my thoughts on the episode. I was still in high school when I first reviewed this, and I didn't know what I was doing back then. So then, what do I think of this episode now? Well, actually, I get where former me is coming from. This episode is stupid. Some might argue that's par for the course with Fairly Oddparents, but this episode is on a whole nother level of being stupid. Like, from the very beginning, we see Mr. Turner being pretty neglectful of his son, and I think they were sort of trying to be comedic about it. The problem is, it just comes across as Mr. Turner being a bad father, acting like he's doing these jobs for Timmy's benefit. There might actually be something to this story if Mr. Turner actually has a real job, but these odd jobs Mr. Turner does make absolutely no sense. This is up to and including a job where Mr. Turner basically throws his own money away. But yet, I think the intent is that they want us to feel like Mr. Turner is doing the best he can to provide a life for the family. I don't buy that at all. And because I don't buy that Mr. Turner isn't a horrible father in the beginning, it means that I can't buy that he's sincere in the end. Mr. Turner all of a sudden cares about his son at the end of the episode, and saves him from all these additional dads, and it comes basically out of nowhere. The Mr. Turner at the beginning of the episode and at the end almost feel like two different characters. So yes, 4 years later, Add-A-Dad is still
A bad episode.
Episode 102B, Squirrely Puffs. Timmy and the Squirrely Scouts try to summit a mountain before the Cream Puffs. There were many times watching this episode where I felt conflicted. At many points there were moments or things that could have almost made this episode bad, but thankfully the episode went in a different direction. This is kind of a comedically light episode, so I thought it would be sort of boring, but it never really did get boring. I think that's partially due to the fact that it never seems like one side is going to win the challenge for too long at any point in the episode. It also seems at first like this episode is going to fall into the trap of Love Struck, where they try to have a battle of the sexes and unintentionally end up saying that one is better than the other. In this episode, it ends up being a collaboration, which is kind of a cop-out, but that's still better than having unfortunate implications. Especially since the episode doesn't take itself too seriously. Since the comedy in this episode is light, it almost sends this episode into okay territory, but there are enough moments that got a chuckle out of me that I do consider this episode good. Episode 103A, Micecapades. In the absence of TV, Poof turns Timmy and Vicky into cartoon characters. I want to be as charitable as possible with this one, since I know it's trying its hardest to be engaging, but it really wasn't. The presence of jokes in this episode is an illusion. A lot of it is the same running gags over and over again, which weren't even funny the first time. Like Timmy's parents just giving random things names, or Cosmo not knowing how to conjure a TV. It all got old pretty quickly, and because they put so much focus into the running gags, the Tom and Jerry homage doesn't get the screen time it needs. I think the episode could have been good if it did, but instead it's an okay episode. The story is essentially Babyface with the Tom and Jerry coat of paint awkwardly slapped on, and personally, I think the idea of a Tom and Jerry type episode could have really worked, but there isn't enough focus on that aspect, and Timmy's vulnerability makes the story drag on, and that's something that I didn't really enjoy. At least it's sort of better than Babyface, which is one of the worst Season 4 episodes. But really, do you as a writer want your episode's legacy to be slightly better than one of the worst Season 4 episodes? Yeah, I didn't think so. Episode 103B, Formula for Disaster. Cosmo and Wanda use Timmy's comatose parents as puppets to fool Mr. Crocker. This was a really fun episode to watch. I liked a lot of the little moments in the episode detached from the story, because honestly I think the story with this one is a little weak. At first you think it's going to be about Timmy trying to escape Crocker's military academy, but then it turns into a stall episode, which actually does create more joke opportunities, so it works out. Crocker's obliviousness is what makes him such a great character on this show, and in this episode it really gives us some good moments. Like, he knows there's something wrong, yet he doesn't question anything and he just goes along with it, and I really like that. The joke is more than just Crocker is horrible to Timmy and his classmates, which gets old sometimes. They could have easily made the episode about that, but they found something more creative. I wasn't super crazy about the B-plot with Poof, but the movie references are at least amusing, so they weren't a complete waste of time, but all in all, it was a good episode. Episode 104A, Bad Air Day. Poof accidentally spends the day with Mr. Crocker. Honestly, I think if they keep going with the Crocker episodes, this season has a chance to be really good. Right after last episode, which was good, this one is another one that focuses on Crocker, and it doesn't disappoint. A lot of the moments with Crocker acting as a father figure to the son he never had is really adorable. And it works because even though Crocker is still a bad person, everything he tries to do with Poof ends up backfiring. But he doesn't seem noticeably bothered, and this allows the numerous jokes in this episode to really work their magic, no pun intended. The B-plot of Timmy frantically searching for Poof is also really funny, mainly because his own negligence backfires and he ends up noticeably physically exhausted and hurt by the end, which is funny in a slapsticky sort of way. They even brought back the gag of Cosmo not knowing what Wanda is saying, which first appeared in Power Mad. But really the whole story is funny, and the conclusion is satisfying, where the robot Crocker built actually comes back to him and it's just overall a nice watch. We finally see a different side to Crocker that isn't just giving kids Fs and wanting to find Timmy's fairies. He actually has hopes and dreams, and we explore what actually happens when they get realized for a short amount of time. And because of the way they're explored, what with him being a villain, they did a nice job of that as well, as Crocker does still get some slapstick dealt his way. Even though he has some nice sweet moments, he's still a pathetic creep that lives with his mother, and one of the main villains of the show. So to see things go back to the status quo while still having a nice ending was tough to pull off, but they managed to do it. Overall, this is not just a good episode, but one of the best of the entire series. Episode 104B, Freaks and Greeks. The Greek gods have a party at Timmy's home after Timmy destroys theirs. So this episode is a very busy one. The plot moves too fast to the point that you barely remember what happened 30 seconds ago because the scene changes too much. A lot of times you have an A plot and a B plot in the Fairly Oddparents. This episode has an A plot, a B plot, and a C plot, and the actual main meat of the episode doesn't start until about a third of the way through. Nothing in this episode gets its time to breathe, and as a result, no story in this episode really feels like a story. You have Timmy worrying about the Greek gods destroying his parents' house, and you have Wanda rebuilding the building at Mount Olympus, and you have Timmy's parents at their own party. But I have to question something. If it was so easy for Cosmo to poof everything back to normal, why was Timmy so concerned about breaking his mother's glass collection? Especially when, even though he still breaks it in the end, Mrs. Turner doesn't seem very bothered by it. It's like the makers of this are saying, none of this episode mattered in the first place. And because they admit that, I'm admitting that this is just an okay episode. There's nothing awful here, but there's nothing in this episode that ever gets a chance to be funny or interesting. Episode 105A, Flyboy. In the process of trying to watch a movie, Timmy swaps heads with a fly. This episode goes through some interesting locales, and while we have seen characters shrink in size before, we haven't really seen them do so in this way. Because of that, I was still invested in the episode. There weren't too many jokes that made me laugh. In fact, the only one I thought was that good was the highlight of the episode. And it is a running gag, so it is seen a few times in the episode. I think maybe if this episode had a few more jokes, it could have been really good. But this is one of the first episodes that really focuses on the duo of both Poof and Timmy that's actually enjoyable to watch. Because in this episode, it doesn't feel like Timmy really owes any kind of responsibility to keep him safe. They're both trying to survive as flies and not let the fly version of Timmy wreak havoc, which is a nice nuance to the episode. I'm gonna give it a good, by the slightest of margins, but it won't make any top 5 lists, and honestly, it still lacked the wow factor that could have made it really good. Episode 105B, Temporary Fairy. Jorgen becomes Timmy's temporary fairy. Have any of you seen Pre-Hibernation Week from SpongeBob? Because I'm pretty sure the makers of this episode definitely took some inspiration from that. The problem is that the story doesn't fit the Fairly Oddparents as well as they would have hoped. Some of the problems with this episode weren't really related to the fit of the show and were instead self-inflicted. Such as the middle portion of the episode where Timmy seems really cruel towards Cosmo and Wanda, for basically no reason. Like, Timmy, they still granted your wishes, just more appropriate versions of them for the god sibling that you asked for. Timmy being so cruel to them was really out of character, and it sets up the ending to be really forced. Timmy gets out of this by publicly humiliating Jorgen, which I guess is pretty understandable, but they failed to actually make it funny for the audience, which is what I think they were going for. None of the story beats really flow like I think they wanted it to, and so the characters seem out of character, and nothing that happens is very believable. I'm gonna give it a bad. It's on the lighter side of bad, but there was too much about this episode that was frustrating for me to rank it any higher. Episode 106A, Crocker Shocker. Mr. Crocker's hypnotism into not believing in fairies causes a power outage in Fairy World. As the other Crocker-focused episodes this season have been pretty good, I was expecting the same from this one. Did it deliver? Kind of. I do like that Crocker's lunacy over fairies is what gives Fairy World its magic. I'm not sure, but it seems like that's been contradicted before, but I can't think of when off the top of my head. The ending where Dr. Fancyfree goes crazy just like Crocker was a pretty fun twist I wasn't expecting. Although, in hindsight, it probably should have been pretty obvious. Maybe a few more jokes in the episode would have made it better. The middle section sort of drags, but overall I do think this is a fairly mild good episode. Not really one of my absolute favorites, but I can't deny how amusing some parts of the episode were. I would have made a few changes, like having the cool Crocker thing play out a bit longer, but this episode is still definitely way better than being okay or bad. Episode 106B, Super Zero. Cosmo becomes a superhero. Over the years, it seems like Cosmo has gotten more and more useless in the show. Something about this episode tells me that the people that made this show were aware of this and tried to correct their past mistakes. Did they succeed? Well, in reality, it was probably never going to happen. You're never going to be able to make bad episodes from the past good. So what did they do with this one? They made it also bad instead of giving Cosmo an actual purpose. He still screws things up to the point that things would be better off without him. Instead of actually solving an actual conflict, Timmy and Wanda create a fake one for him to solve that comes across as insulting both to Cosmo if he wasn't so dumbed down, and to the audience. It's like they're saying, here you go, you don't get a real conflict in the episode. And for that matter, we don't get much in the way of funny jokes either. The highlight was really the only funny joke in the episode, but it sucks too because you have a lot of potential with the premise of the episode, but it was just really disappointing to watch. 107A, Dadbracadabra. Mr. Crocker suspects Mr. Turner is a fairy after he becomes a famous musician. I'm not much of a fan of this one. Right after the last episode, which tried to address Cosmo's incompetence, we have an episode where the conflict is partially because of Cosmo's incompetence. But honestly, Cosmo really isn't even the worst part of the episode. The main problem with this episode is actually the fun fact. Apparently you can just wish for someone to become a fairy at will, which seems way too overpowered, and could have probably been used to resolve the plots of at least a few episodes of the show. But no, apparently you can do this with no consequences. They don't even have Jorgen come in for a quick scene to warn of the dangers of this. They just treat it as no big deal, when it seems like, actually, it's a huge deal. Hell, it could have even been a ratings trap if they really wanted to milk it that way. Instead, it's seen as any other plot device, and that's a problem with the episode to me. In any other episode, that would be against the rules, but since it's convenient to this episode's plot, it's not against the rules. The rest of the episode is pretty barren. We've seen Timmy's dad gain confidence due to magic before, and we've seen it happen in better episodes that don't make me question the rules. It's a bad episode. 107B, Timmy Turnip. Timmy wishes his parents never left their home country. This episode was on track to being really good. I laughed at a lot of the jokes in the beginning portion of the episode, because I think, aside from the Crocker one, just presenting a lot of the interesting things about this fake country presents a lot of potential for jokes. My big problem with this episode is definitely the second half, and the conflict resolution in general. Because they spend so long setting everything up, it means that everything after the setup has to be paced really fast. We barely spend any time with Timmy dealing with the consequence of his wish. Things just suck for 2 seconds, and then they're basically resolved instantly after that point in the episode. And the ending is confusing. Why do the grandparents' voices change? They can still be rich and have the same voices. That was a weird decision, especially when it's pretty inferable that they're rich from the fact that they own a fast food chain. It seems like they expected it to be a much bigger twist than it actually was. So while I like the jokes at the beginning, everything after it falls apart and drags it down to okay territory. 108A, One-Man Band. Timmy becomes a famous musician. I think we've kind of seen this type of story done on the show at least once, with more characters than just Timmy. I mean, yes, we've seen fame go to Timmy's head in Wishology, and we've seen it go to Mr. Turner's head a few episodes ago, and it's even happened with Mrs. Turner and Mother Nature. So I wasn't particularly excited to see them do a story they've already done a lot, and the fact that they don't do that much that's funny in this episode makes that problem a lot more visible. Timmy in this episode isn't a total douche, but I think that was on accident. If the pacing gave more time for that story beat to happen, I think that's what they were going for. So while the pacing kept this episode from being as bad as it could have been, it's still okay. Timmy being bad at something and then suddenly being good at that thing is so overplayed at this point that you have to do a lot in this episode to make it stand out. But it just seemed like a half-baked version of that type of story, which means this episode isn't even good at being bad. Episode 108B, Frenemy Mine. After losing all of her friends, Vicky acts nicer towards Timmy. This episode is an even better version of Vicky loses her Icky from Season 4. For one, the jokes in this episode were a lot funnier than the ones in the aforementioned episode. I like the increasingly long acronyms Vicky uses, and I liked the slow-moving construction equipment parade, and I also liked Vicky's cult being interrupted by one of the members' mothers. The jokes were a lot more saturated in this episode than pretty much any episode so far in Season 7. I also liked the different direction the story went in. It could have very easily been a ripoff of Vicky loses her Icky. But instead of the viewer being disappointed that Vicky changes, they make her just as annoying when she's nice as she is when she's mean, meaning it doesn't feel cheap when the episode returns to the status quo at the end. In Snowbound especially, that's what got it a bad rating. Overall, I'd say this episode is good. It's probably one of the funniest episodes so far this season, and the story goes in an interesting direction. It's actually a nice watch. 109A, Chicken Poofs. Poof catches a contagious disease. This is a very zany episode, as was the last one. I think it's nice to see that because some of the stories earlier this season were slow to start. Thankfully, this episode doesn't beat around the bush and we get right into the story. I like the visuals in this episode, lots of really cool locations, and the homage to Indiana Jones was nice as well. They do a nice job of subverting expectations. The flour they retrieve isn't actually used in the medicine for one, and the medicine just gets poured into a cup. It might come off as cheap to some, but I'm just glad that not everything in this episode was expected. And besides, I doubt they'd impale a baby with a giant syringe in a kids' show. In addition to the other things I enjoyed, they did a good job of involving other characters in the story. There's Rip Studwell, Timmy's parents, Crocker, Doug Dimmadome, and yeah, Rip Studwell can kind of be a dick in this episode, but I don't have much of a problem with it, because he gets beaten over the head with an umbrella and burned to a crisp at the end of the episode. The two minor problems I have with this episode are the fact that everyone else is cured when Poof takes the medicine, which is not how diseases work, and the fact that Rip Studwell mentions multiple times how he can get a discount on medicine at the fairy pharmacy. Stop implying fairies have a monetary system. But regardless, those problems didn't stop me from giving this episode a good. Episode 109B, Stupid Cupid. Cosmo inaccurately shoots Cupid's arrows. I don't know if I've seen a more unfocused plot this season. This episode seems like it wants to do a million things at once, and does none of them well. The story is generic. It's one of the most base-level ones possible given the premise, and the jokes that complement it weren't very great either. Timmy's parents being stupid wasn't interesting enough, Cupid being, well, Cupid didn't help either, and we've seen Trixie almost fall in love with Timmy, but get reversed in the end enough to know that nothing in this episode will last. The tension is gone before the episode even starts. At least they put in the effort to try to at least make something out of this episode, but to me, the jokes don't land. You can't afford to have that happen when the story is basic and generic. If you're watching through the series, this will probably be a skip for you, lest you waste 11 minutes of your life. For me, it falls on the lower side of okay. It's not anger-inducing enough to be bad, but the amount of things they try to do makes none of them interesting to me. 110A, Double O Schnozmo. Cosmo's brother comes over for a visit. For an episode that tries to be a James Bond spoof, it doesn't seem very eager to actually get into the James Bond portion of the story. A spy episode should be action-packed. The story should constantly be moving, or at least be funny about it. This episode does not do that. It pays lip service to a lot of the tropes that they try to use in this episode. Most of it is just characters sitting and talking, which isn't something that usually makes for a good Fairly Oddparents episode. The few jokes that there are a running gag stolen from a few episodes ago, and the recurring ninjas from this Japanese restaurant that we later find out Jorgen owns for some reason. Schnozmo is described as a con artist, but we never really see it in action to the degree it needs to feel believable. Even after watching this episode, I really don't know that I connected enough to Schnozmo to feel like he's an actual character. The episode's just really boring, that's all there is to say. It's not good, and it's not bad either, it's just an okay episode, and a pretty forgettable one at that. Episode 110B, Planet Poof. Poof ends up in Yugopatamia. I know at first it seems like this episode is going to be a rehash of Bad Air Day, but they do go in a different direction with it, enough to make it interesting. I think it's good every now and then to have episodes focusing on Poof. Since they insisted on establishing him as a new character, justifying his existence by giving him his own episodes is a smart move, and in this episode I liked what they did with him. He doesn't become power hungry when he becomes royalty, he just stays a normal baby that wants someone to play with him. It keeps Poof likable, and we get more screen time of Yugopatamians that aren't Mark, which is a plus. Maybe the ending didn't have to quite drag like it did, but that's small in my opinion. I think this was a good episode, and it definitely was a good appearance for Poof. He needed to become a stronger character. Too many shows use babies as simple objects. This episode is another reminder that Poof actually has personality. Now, if only we could see Foop again. Episode 111A, The Boss of Me. Timmy becomes the boss at his father's company, where he eventually has to fire him. From start to finish, this episode was stupid. The entire story has problems throughout. Let's start at the beginning, where Mr. Turner basically tries to rent another kid to take Timmy's place. Even if played for laughs, that isn't something you should add to the episode. We've already had an episode this season about how Mr. Turner cares a lot about Timmy even if it doesn't seem like it. That completely goes out the window with that one scene. Then there's the actual wish portion of the episode where Mr. Turner claims to have named this indestructible pencil, even though the name was written on the pencil as soon as Timmy wished for it. Either that's a poorly conveyed joke or they didn't know what they were doing, and I lean towards the latter because it isn't even conveyed like a joke. They don't make it seem like Mr. Turner got the idea from reading the name on the side of the pencil. It seems to me like the 3D model was made before the story was completely ironed out. And getting back to story, the ending of this episode is one of the worst endings in the entire series. First of all, the company goes out of business because people only need one pencil, so they don't buy more. Any competently run company would sell the Everleady for a ridiculous price, and then still keep selling regular pencils for people that can't afford the luxury item. I'm sorry, but I don't buy the way they handle that plot point, no pun intended. And then people have to get rid of their Everleadys after gaining massive muscles from using them so much. That's one of the laziest plot points in the entire show. It's a
bad episode.
As if I even needed to say that. Episode 111B. He poofs, he scores. Or actually, there's no comma, so I guess it's just he poofs, he scores. Poof controls Timmy's brain, making him better at soccer. I think the charm of this episode makes me forgive some of its flaws. For one, I like the atmosphere of the episode. I like that Cosmo and Wanda get their own B-plot so the story can focus on Timmy. And I like the visuals in this episode. And since the last time they did a sports episode it was really stupid, it was refreshing to see. There were even some nice jokes in this episode, such as Cosmo saying Timmy's brain doesn't exist. There are some things I didn't like about the story, such as Poof being inside Timmy's brain, and that's the catalyst for his athleticism, but I think they needed a way to circumvent the rules, and honestly, that's a lot more creative than some of the ideas they could have used, so I can give it a pass. And I do like that they don't make Timmy lose in the end as soon as he loses the magic, just so they can teach him a lesson. They let him and Mr. Turner have their win, and it's not the direction I was expecting them to go. But after watching this for this review, it did jog my memory from my childhood a little bit, seeing Timmy hit the opposite goal on purpose. So, yeah, I'll give this episode a good. 112A, Playdate of Doom. Foop tricks Wanda into believing he's turned good. I hate this episode so much. People clown on a pal for Gary from SpongeBob, but the truth is, a lot of cartoons around the time had an episode like that. And part of why Phineas and Ferb was so great was because it did that kind of story correctly basically in every episode. If you're unsure what I'm referring to, I'm talking about Wanda's willful ignorance that her own son is in danger, and her blindness to Foop basically trying to kill her son. Especially since she takes convincing to believe he's changed. Wanda is supposed to be the more sensible one in comparison to Cosmo, but in this episode, I don't buy how blind to obvious realities she is. It is painful to watch, it really is, and it's a jarring character portrayal as well. I was not expecting this, and I imagine most other viewers wouldn't be as well. It's a bad episode. It's not fun to watch characters be blind to reality for 11 minutes. Episode 112B, Teacher's Pet. Timmy literally becomes the teacher's pet. This episode is an interesting one for sure. It seems like they had two stories in mind for how this episode could go, and instead of picking one, they just decided, let's do both of them. The episode really suffers because of it. At the beginning, you'd think the plot would be about them trying to turn Timmy back to his human self, but really, that part of the story is resolved with few, if any, obstacles, and they cut away in the middle to disguise that. But the rest of the story of them trying to turn Crocker back to normal is boring at the beginning and confusing after that. And it's not explained how Timmy can manipulate the circuitry of Crocker's machine, as it doesn't seem like that's a skill he's had in any other episode. There's not a lot as far as good jokes either, as I think that everything that was supposed to be a joke fell flat. I'm gonna give it a bad. This one was closer to being okay, but the sloppy execution couldn't be ignored. 113A, Manic Mom Day. Timmy swaps lives with his mother. There are certainly worse episodes than this, not even in the entire show, just this season, but man, I'm having a tough time remembering an episode that felt like a bigger slap in the face than this one. From start to finish, Wanda is incredibly unlikable, always trying to make Timmy's experience worse just to prove a point. And then on the flip side, Mrs. Turner has a really great experience, and basically lives through all of Timmy's dreams without him present. I get the lesson they were trying to go for, that basically you don't realize how good you have it until you're in someone else's shoes, but it doesn't work when focusing on a character who is repeatedly shown to have a crap life. Hell, Timmy only has Cosmo and Wanda because his life is terrible. Having a busy life is not worse than being abused by your incompetent parents and spiteful teacher, no matter how you want to spin it. And because they try to minimize Timmy's struggles, it makes this episode very uncomfortable to watch. It's a bad episode. And unlike a lot of bad episodes this season, it's bad for very uncomfortable reasons. It's on the level of Vicky Gets Fired or It's a Wishful Life as far as uncomfortability goes. 113B, Crocker of Gold. Cosmo gives Mr. Crocker a pot of gold belonging to a family of leprechauns. Fun fact, for some reason this episode didn't air anywhere close to St. Patrick's Day. That seems to be a huge missed opportunity, but of course, Nickelodeon gonna Nickelodeon. So, how much did I like this episode? Well, there were certain aspects I really liked. The jokes in this episode were pretty nice, like the stoplight and the cutaway to Wanda and Poof in Ireland. Even Cosmo kickstarting the plot was actually better than his usual appearances at this point in the show. While the plot was started due to his ignorance, the story he told at the beginning actually turned out to be true, and Crocker ends up falling for Cosmo as a leprechaun anyway, so he's partially to blame as well. It's a nice story that doesn't just use Cosmo as an excuse to have things go wrong artificially, and because of that, the comedy gets more room to actually be good. There are two things I don't like in this, however. One is how stereotypical the depiction of Ireland is. Like, I wonder what Irish viewers would actually think, especially when considering that stereotypes of a non-white country would probably get this episode banned. The other thing I didn't like was the fact that Cosmo and Wanda lose their wands again. At this point, it's becoming kind of a crutch that I wish they'd stop using. I get that you need to force a conflict, but you don't have to use the same plot point every time. But even with the two things I didn't like, I still like this episode and consider it good. Episode 114A, Beach Blanket Bozos. Mr. and Mrs. Turner compete to be the best surfers on the beach, placing them in Wish Limbo. So now we're at the second episode that takes place at a beach that's about some character trying to upstage everyone. Or in this case, two characters trying to upstage each other. The atmosphere in this episode is really stale, and there aren't enough funny jokes to keep me engaged with the episode. This episode is boring, but normally if an episode was just boring, that would only make it an okay episode. This episode, however, is bad, thanks to two rather large problems. Number one is that I don't like how they keep adding new aspects to the magic system of this world, because one of the draws of the Fairly Oddparents that made it so popular in the first place was the fact that the magic system was so simple and intuitive. But the more things like Wish Limbo they keep adding just to create new stories makes everything hard to keep track of. Also, the way the Wish Limbo is reversed is just dumb. There's really no reason Timmy should be the thing his parents care about more than surfing, because one of the very first gags in the episode was how Timmy flew to Hawaii with all the cargo and the surfboard got an actual seat on the plane. I don't buy it! These two actions should not be done by the same character in the same episode. It's just a confusing experience all around. Episode 114B, Poltergeeks. Mr. and Mrs. Turner go back to their days of hunting ghosts. Yeah, I bet the first thing you expect me to talk about is the Ghostbusters references, and honestly, they only really felt skin deep. They didn't really affect the episode and might have even been my least favorite part of the episode. So yeah, I don't feel the need to talk in depth. I will say though that I enjoyed the jokes in this episode. Timmy's parents' names were kind of a subversion of expectation. Cosmo and Wanda being box-shaped after getting out of the box was funny, as was the "Are you crazy?" joke. So there were some funny jokes in the episode, and in combination with the story, which I really like, the episode isn't as dull as it might seem in the beginning. I like that we dive into Timmy's parents' lives a bit more, and while it was executed poorly in the last episode, in this one they do a nice job. I think it works because in this episode the conflict is that they're trying to stop Mr. and Mrs. Turner from wreaking havoc, whereas in the last episode they straight up created a conflict and put Timmy in danger to force a happy ending. And they have Poof save the day at the end, which is a really cool way to end it, especially since he's really never had a moment like that. In its totality, this episode is good. It's fun throughout. Episode 115A, Old Man and the C-. Mr. Turner goes back and continues his education. Once again we have an episode that shows a bit of history with Timmy's parents, specifically his father. I like that it actually gives a reason why he's so stupid and doesn't just gloss over it. The middle section where he tries to act cool is a bit boring and drags a little bit, but where the episode shines is in the beginning part and the ending. It could have very easily started to be another manic mom day, but they go a different direction by having Timmy help Mr. Turner learn this information in a montage that's a homage to the Rocky movies. They very clearly didn't have to make this about building Mr. Turner up, and could have made yet another episode tearing Timmy down. But they don't go that direction, and because of it, you're rooting for Mr. Turner in the end. The episode is a bit light on jokes, but I do think there's enough here, and as for Cosmo and Wanda, they're surprisingly absent from this episode. Though, at no point did I think they really needed to be here. It's just an observation. It's a good episode, and definitely a heartwarming one at the end. Episode 115B, Balance of Flower. The fairies must win a bake-off to prevent godchildren from being handed over to the anti-fairies. Fun fact, the ending gag is a reference to Dying for Pie from SpongeBob, which I hope is true, otherwise they basically just stole a joke. Anyway, this episode is squarely on track to being rated as good, and then it completely fumbles it away at the end. There were a lot of good jokes, like the running gag that is the highlight of this episode, the Tiddlywinks cutaway, and Mother Nature talking about that day saying, "I made it myself." And up until the last minute or so, the story is really engaging and action-packed. I wasn't super thrilled about them adding even more lore to the show in this episode, but I also think it's relatively self-contained, so I wasn't that bothered by it. But the biggest problem for me was that the Anti-Fairies entry in the Bake-Off comes completely out of nowhere, to the point that they blatantly lie to us. We see Cosmo's entire recipe, but before that we see the Anti-Fairies making Cosmo's recipe, and they're using ingredients we know are in the actual recipe. The fact that they ended up with nothing on their tray is blatantly contradicted in a previous scene, so the ending makes zero sense. In fact, because of the ending, it drags this episode from good to okay. If they just proofread a little more, that wouldn't have even been an issue. Episode 116A, Food Fight. Timmy wishes his mother was the best cook in the world. So this episode is one that could have very easily fallen into the trap of being too similar to Mother Nature from Season 3, which was an episode I considered to be bad. Surprisingly though, Food Fight is that episode done right. What sets this episode apart is that in here, Timmy comes to his own conclusion that he needs to help his mom, and she also still thinks that she's a good cook. In fact, she was a good cook the whole time, which was a clever twist I didn't expect. It just makes the episode end in a good feeling, and that's one thing the show does really well in general. Sometimes they feel unearned, but this is not one of those times. I also like the jokes in this episode. The highlight was the punny chef names, but there's also the running gag of the sausage fields, which doesn't get old despite how much you think it would. I also enjoyed the visuals here. The colors seem more vibrant than normal, and the scene directly after the wish where Mrs. Turner makes this feast is one of the most gorgeous scenes in Season 7. So, yeah, it's a good episode. Episode 116B, Please Don't Feed the Turners. Dark Laser traps the Turners in a zoo exhibit. This episode was a nice watch. It actually does have some high stakes considering Cosmo and Wanda are basically stranded in outer space for part of it, and they have to do some clever maneuvering to get their magic to even work properly so the conflict can be resolved. I honestly didn't expect Dark Laser to come back in the show considering how I had heard that most of the secondary characters basically don't appear in the later seasons. But I'm glad to see him again because he's the comedic and competent villain done right. And his interaction with Timmy's parents is genuinely some of the funniest material all season. They keep asking for more cool stuff while acting like they would hate it, and Dark Laser falls for it every time. And it is really hilarious stuff. And it works with Mr. and Mrs. Turner's stupidity really well. That's what's so great about this. It uses every character at their best, so of course, I'm gonna give it a good. It isn't Dark Laser's last appearance, but I really don't see them topping this. 117A, Take and Fake. Timmy uses Mark Chang's device to disguise himself and sneak into Trixie's party. So this is a roller coaster of an episode, and possibly the one I had the hardest time deciding a rating for. I say this because most of the episode, i.e. the Timmy portions of the episode, are really dumb and don't have much interesting going on. It's just him as this buff, handsome guy, and then suddenly becoming grotesque at the worst possible moment, and that shtick gets old pretty quickly. But then there's the parts of the episode with Cosmo and Wanda, Crocker, and Timmy's parents, and all of those are really good moments, and basically the only parts of the episode that have any kind of jokes in them. And then there's also the ending, which is pretty insulting. I mean, it was good until we find out that it was actually Tootie, one of my least favorite characters all along, so I really don't know what to do. On one hand, I really like some of the mundane conversational scenes, but then the Timmy portions of the episode and the ending in general bring it down, so I guess it falls on the lower side of okay, but I could easily see someone really liking this episode, and I could also easily see someone really hating it. Episode 117B, Cosmo Rules. Cosmo is put in charge of enforcing the rules while Jorgen is sick. This episode turns a usual problem with a lot of episodes on its head, and the fact that Cosmo often does whatever stupid thing the plot demands tends to be a real problem. This time, it's Timmy's incompetence and greed that ends up almost destroying the universe, so it's a nice change of pace and a subversion of expectations. Once again, I'm not super crazy about all the added lore for similar reasons to what I've already talked about, so I'll spare that lecture once again. But honestly, this episode is kind of light story-wise, or at least lighter than you'd expect given the high stakes. It's predictable, and maybe that's just because I've seen a lot of Fairly Oddparents, but I think they could have gone in a more interesting direction. But what saves this episode for me are some of the little comedic moments. There's Cosmo with the cookie, there's Poof living up to his name and poofing things up that the characters are talking about, and there's even the ending gag, which gives Timmy a well-deserved ending. So despite the dullness, there were just enough moments I liked for me to barely give this episode a good. Episode 1... Wait a minute. Where's the graphic? Oh, there it is. So yeah, 118A, Lights Out. Timmy wishes for 12 hours of pitch black. Lights Out is one of those episodes where just everything is wrong with it. The most obvious problem is that it's not engaging at all, because most of the episode is completely pitch black. And this episode is the laziest of the entire series. You could listen to this episode on the radio, and you'd lose nothing, which is kind of a problem, considering that this aired on network television. but even if this episode were actually animated, it would still be awful. Consider that because nothing is visible in this episode, things that are spatially impossible to happen just happen back to back. Timmy falls down a hill onto a freeway and then somehow ends up on a train track, and then somehow ends up on an airport runway after that. This sequence happens back to back, but I guess they just use no animation as an excuse to let random things happen. Like, if you're gonna follow this as a story, what happens from one moment to the next is very hard to follow. I mean, it's everyone chasing after Timmy and just overall making it an uncomfortable experience for him. There's no reason that making it seem like you're gonna eat Timmy is a proportional punishment for reading a scary story to Poof. And of course, add to the fact that Tootie is your usual creepy self, although, thankfully for the last time. So, in general, this is a
bad episode.
No surprises there. At any given moment, you think this episode can't get any worse, and then it does, right until the end. Most of the bad episodes have been pretty light on the badness scale this season. This is legitimately one of the worst episodes of the entire series. Episode 118B, Dad Overboard. Mr. Turner tries to get his family off a deserted island, and due to his own ego, he goes insane. So, fun fact, this episode contains an elf bowling reference. It's very subtle, and it's at the very end of the episode, but there's a moment where Mr. Turner drives through Santa's workshop and elves get knocked up in the air and a bowling pin sound effect plays. You can't tell me that's not an elf bowling reference. Anyway, this episode is really good. I like a lot of the jokes in the episode, like the highlight, where Mr. Turner and Mr. Crocker feel unfulfilled and start calling themselves Linda. But I also like how Mr. Turner builds a boat store so he can buy a boat to get off the island instead of just building a boat and getting off the island. It's so stupid it's funny, and it's a nice way to blend jokes and plot. I think overall it's a nice arc for Mr. Turner, since he is pretty stupid, but they're at least giving him some episodes to not feel completely stupid. I do have a few problems with the episode, like the fact that the conflict starts due to Cosmo's incompetence, and the fact that this episode appears to take place in the span of one day, but Crocker is still in the classroom, and then all of a sudden the class is on a field trip. But, I don't think those two things mattered that much. 119A, Farm Pit. Mr. Turner starts a farm to avoid his morning commute. This one is kind of a boring one, and while there were some things I liked about it, there were also some things I didn't like. I'm not crazy about how they keep using Cosmo as a cheap way of creating conflict due to his stupidity, especially when they do it in such a predictable way. It's easy to see from miles away that he's going to have already had the wands, and I'm not crazy about them losing the wands again because, as I've said before, it's a crutch. And also, we went from a pretty good Mr. Turner appearance in the last episode to a pretty bad one here. He keeps confusing a scarecrow for Timmy, which is stupid beyond his normal stupidity, and when he finds out that Timmy got carried away by a tornado, he's more concerned that he won't have someone to do all of his work on the farm. Mr. Turner is really unlikable here, and it's a shame after how great his last appearance was. I did like the Cleveland scenes, but they're kind of tainted by Cosmo's stupidity that's not really charming, especially when the wands are lost at that point. But even with the wands being lost, Cosmo still manages to poof up a fish out of thin air, and Poof somehow turns into a dog without a wand. Those are the kinds of mistakes that you shouldn't even make. It's a
bad episode.
There's an idea here for sure, but the way they execute it falls into the trap of a lot of bad episodes this season. 119B, Croc Talk. Mr. Turner calls into Crocker's web show after multiple monster sightings. This one's a really fun episode. I like the idea of it, and it's used to good effect. Croc Talk, the show, is a really good vehicle for a lot of jokes about how pathetic Crocker is, and I tend to be a sucker for Crocker episodes anyway. There's always something happening in this episode, and there's not really any dull moments. I think what really works about this is that Crocker gets promptly punished in the form of slapstick, every time he tries to do something important. The highlight, of course, is Mr. Turner's obsession with Crocker's show, which I found to be really enjoyable, and they get a lot of gags out of that. Even some of the little visual gags in the episode are nice, like when Crocker does his fairy godparents scream, his body forms the shape of the letters FGP, which was a nice touch to that scene. I'm kinda glad we got this, because there aren't that many slapstick-heavy episodes in Season 7, but then, out of nowhere, we get this one, and it's really what the doctor ordered. Of course, it's a good episode. 120A, Spellementary School. Poof is enrolled in Spellementary School. My favorite part of the episode were the opening gags. For the first 2 or so minutes of the episode, the gags are large in number, and they all land. Poof changing into his school uniform was pretty funny, and Wanda being overly emotional about leaving Poof behind while he's ambivalent is also funny, because it's a well-deserved slap in the face to Wanda. As soon as they drop Poof off at the school though, nothing else after that is really funny. I can see moments where they try to tell jokes, but I didn't think a lot of them landed. Which is a shame because once the jokes stop being funny, it becomes very evident how light the story is in this episode. This episode is the curtain gag from SpongeBob. That's really it. And there's not a lot of substance behind that. Everyone loves Poof, and everyone hates Foop. That's pretty much all the substance we get. And they didn't even write a real ending to the story. They just have the bell ring, and the explanation we get is that everything returns back to normal. It really seems like they just wrote that in because they couldn't think of a way to end the episode. Because at no point in the episode is that even slightly foreshadowed. I also didn't like how they implied that Poof is old enough to go to school, but they didn't do anything meaningfully to age him up. So to the audience, it's like he's still an infant. I mean, every other kid in the school can actually talk, but not Poof. So nothing is meaningfully conveyed. Either have him stay an infant, or age him up so there's some kind of logical consistency. So the opening gags I think are good enough to save this from being bad, which makes it barely an okay episode. But if you considered it to be bad, I would certainly understand why. 120B, Operation Dinkelberg. Mr. Turner spies on Mr. Dinkelberg. So because we still have another season to go, albeit 5 episodes, I'm not going to say much about this one. I do think it's good though. And that's mostly because of the Roadrunner Wile E. Coyote dynamic to Mr. Turner and Mr. Dinkelberg that I personally think is underused in the series. This isn't the most hilarious episode, but it did get some laughs, and I think the ending where Mr. Dinkelberg acts evil just to not hurt Mr. Turner's feelings is a nice twist, even though you can kind of see it coming. A lot of the comedy in this comes from Timmy reacting to his father's obsession, which I think needs to happen more. A character like Mr. Turner is really good when his overreactions have a straight man to play off of. Timmy serves that role here, so that allows the comedy here to be really good. There's not much to say except the jokes here really work. And that was every episode of Fairly Oddparents Season 7 reviewed. So before we get into Season 8, I want to show you the chart for Season 7. So we have 18 good episodes, 9 okay episodes, and 12 bad episodes. I think what stands out to me was how deceptively few the okay episodes were, considering that most of the good and bad episodes were close to being okay. It's just one of those situations where the season has a lot of variance in opinion, and so some of the okay episodes might fall one way or the other to a lot of people, and vice versa. Percentage-wise, the goods are very similar to Season 6, with more bad episodes in Season 7. But interestingly, the chart is very similar to Season 3, which is eerie considering how similar Season 2 and Season 6 charts were. But personally, I do think 3 is the better season, as the good episodes in Season 3 were clearly better and a lot funnier. But yeah, I do consider Season 7 predictably to be an okay season. I think there were times when the show had really good moments in Season 7, but for the most part, I don't really have strong opinions about Season 7. As for notes, I only have a few. Number 1 is that Vicky is very absent this season. I don't know if the writers just thought her shtick wore thin, but it's clear that for whatever reason they had more of an aversion to using this character. And honestly, I get it. Most jokes you can tell with Vicky are funnier when told with a character like Mr. Crocker, and so he got the nod in more episodes this season. And in general, I think secondary characters are used a lot less in general this season. Chester and AJ make cameos, but aren't actively a part of a lot of episodes. This is the last season where we see Tootie or Trixie Tang, and this is Francis's last season as well. But Timmy's parents are in this season a lot, noticeably more than in the rest of the show. But it's sad to see that even as they keep adding new characters to this show, they barely use some of the ones in the show already. And lastly for notes, this season introduces a lot more lore to the show, which is hit or miss. It was definitely a problem in a few of the episodes, but I can't think of any where it made enough of a difference to change the rating. We've seen it in other seasons, like in Unwish Island, for example, but they went heavy on the world building, and I have a feeling that if they keep doing this, they're going to contradict themselves more and more. And now, here's the top 5. At number 5, Operation Dinkelberg. At number 4, The Old Man and the C-. At number 3, Formula for Disaster. At number 2, Croc Talk. And at number 1, Bad Air Day. And for the bottom 5, at number 5, Farm Pit for its treatment of Timmy and its rather dull story. At number 4, Super Zero for its reliance on Cosmo's stupidity in an unfunny way. At number 3, Manic Mom Day for how unfair the treatment of Timmy is and how unlikable all the characters are. At number 2, Beach Blanket Bozos because of its confusing story, bad treatment of Timmy, and its ending that comes completely out of nowhere. And at number 1, Lights Out for its laziness. So now, let's move on to Season 8. Episode 121, Love Triangle. Poof and Foop compete for the lead role in the school play. What even is this episode? I've had fever dreams with better plot structure. Let's start with the story. There's not even 22 minutes of story in this episode. I dare say, there's not 22 minutes of potential with the concept. I know Season 8 was supposed to be an extension of Season 7 with 5 specials that ordinarily would have been in Season 7, but this should have just been an 11-minute episode, and Spellementary School should have probably been a 22-minute episode. It's just not how you tell this story. Goldie Goldenglow is a really bland character for this to center around. Besides having a southern accent, I can't think of a single personality trait for this character. And having Poof and Foop fight over her for the entire episode seems really unjustified. We, as the audience, have to know this character to be invested in the story, and despite being 22 minutes, this episode doesn't seem to want to give us anything other than a blank slate. We don't even know if she's a fairy or not, because if she is, then that'd be a huge plot hole, since it was established that Poof was the exception to the rule, as in, the only new fairy in 10,000 years. My only guess about why they decided to leave it so vague is specifically to avoid answering this question to the audience. I mean, why not? This is basically a throwaway episode anyway. The second half of this is boring because they have to stretch everything out. Mr. Turner is even in this for, I guess, comic relief, but guys, story has to come first for comic relief to be done well. And since this episode had no story, I bet you can figure out the rest.
It's a bad episode.
At least give me something to laugh at if you're not going to tell a story. Episode 122 and 123, Timmy's Secret Wish. After being put on trial for being the worst god kid ever, Timmy's secret wish is discovered. I know this is a pretty hated episode, so let's get the stuff that I liked about this episode out of the way first. First off, I really like that Timmy and Mr. Crocker team up in this episode. That's something I can't remember happening in the series. Also, some of the jokes really work in this episode, like Fat Jorgen, and a few of Cosmo's jokes made me laugh, and also the quote of the episode is funny because it's not really explained, but it is a good running gag in the episode. But aside from those things, which I think were rather small, I didn't really like a lot about this episode. It's a
bad episode.
This is straight up one of the sloppiest stories of the entire show. Let's start off with Timmy's wish. They bring up the last secret wish and explain how every wish made since then was carefully documented. So then, you might ask, how did they not know Timmy made a secret wish? Up to the point when it's brought up, Timmy's secret wish isn't foreshadowed at all. And what's worse is that this carefully documented wish isn't known about by the characters despite the documentation found in Foop's legal briefs. It makes no sense. And despite the fact that the story makes no sense, it still manages to be awful in other ways. There are long stretches in this episode where nothing happens. Usually the Fairly Oddparents is good about filling up 44-minute runtimes. This is the first time in the series where they failed to do so. In fact, the episode kind of makes another 44-minute episode worse in retrospect, since in this episode, he gets to go back to being 10 years old forever, despite the fact that he learns in Channel Chasers that it's okay for things to change as you grow older. Yeah, this episode is so awful it makes one of the best of the series worse. That's a whole new level of bad. 124, Invasion of the Dads. The dads from Attadad invade Earth to steal Mrs. Turner. Despite being a 22-minute episode, I don't really have that much to say about this one. It's just really funny. There's a line in this episode that became a meme where Cosmo says that the dads have a perfectly good civilization, and then wonders why they'd want to add a woman to it, which is funny because Wanda is standing right next to him when he says that. I also like Mrs. Turner naming all the cats Snowball, except for the white fluffy one. And the one-liner Cosmo gets after Robot Timmy explodes is also pretty funny, because the actual Timmy is right there. Even though I didn't like Attadad, this is a pretty decent sequel, and basically contains none of the problems of the original. In the original episode, it seemed like Mr. Turner didn't really care about Timmy at all. From start to finish, Mr. Turner is trying to do his best, he's just not good at it and floods the house. And I thought that was just going to be a throwaway gag, but no, that's how the conflict is solved, which ties a nice bow on the episode, and is also my favorite part. So, yeah, it's a good episode. Episode 125, When Losers Attack. Timmy's enemies team up to try to kill him. If you ever wonder what Dread and Breakfast would be like as a suspenseful, action-packed 22-minute episode, this is what it would be. And in addition, it's also decently funny. Mr. Crocker disguised as Trixie Tang is seriously one of the funniest moments of the whole show, and Mr. Turner even gets a good line in when he says, "Wow, Trixie Tang has really let herself go." The team name is pretty funny as well, and Cosmo constantly talking about different holidays during Wanda's explanations is a very Cosmo joke to make. But what really makes this episode work so well is the villain team-up. I like the angle that Foop, Crocker, and Dark Laser are so pathetic that they need someone actually competent to whip them into shape. Especially because they fail in the beginning even though Timmy doesn't have magic to help him. The villain team is just a great mix of personalities that gets together both comedically and story-wise, and it makes the episode good. I do have a couple of minor problems though. One is the fun fact. Like, they use a geocentric model to explain the fairy eclipse, which is just so stupid. It's not really presented like a joke, it's presented like they don't know how eclipses work. And also, gee, I wonder where they got the idea to have an eclipse take away someone's powers. Seriously, I know in this episode it affects the good guys and not the bad guys, but to have really similar ideas on the same network 4 years apart is a little suspect. Especially when the main villain in both episodes is a teenage girl voiced by Grey Delisle. 126. Meet the Oddparents. Mr. and Mrs. Turner find out about the existence of Cosmo and Wanda. I was originally going to write this episode off for having very little story and sort of having a dull middle section. I mean, for a 22-minute episode, you've got to really justify the runtime, and just the base concept of the episode seems like something that would be done really poorly, especially this late in the series. They kept some nice jokes peppered in, though. Jorgen's obsession with amusement parks is my favorite part of the episode, but it's also just really funny. They've sort of smoothed some of Jorgen's edges and made him more of a comedic character as time has gone on, and for all the changes the show has made as it's gone on, that's actually a good one. There's a funny moment with Dinkelberg as well, where he gets shrunk and a cat looks like he's going to attack him, but then he remembers the bowl of milk Dinkelberg gave him. There's other good jokes in the episode, and to me, that plus the ending makes me forgive the light story toward the middle of the episode. Plus, they really stuck the landing. I mean, this is really one of the best endings since For Emergencies Only. It just ends the episode on a good feeling, which is what they really needed. If Channel Chasers or Wishology wasn't going to be a series finale, then this episode would have ended the series nicely. And if they had ended this episode any way besides the way they did, this episode would have felt more like a pilot to a spin-off than an actual Fairly OddParents episode. So, while I do acknowledge the flaws of this episode, I still do think it's good. And that's Season 8 reviewed. If you're curious, this is the list of Season 8's episodes from best to worst, but now here's the chart. Because of the small sample size, it does mean the statistics are a bit skewed, but this is the first season without an okay episode, and I was kinda shocked. But since a majority of the episodes are good, and I overall enjoyed my experience outside the 2 bad episodes, I think Season 8 is the 3rd good season of the series. Although, I'd have to rank it beneath Seasons 1 and 5. So, yeah, that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.